My name's Steve. I'm one of the moderators for Lawless, which is why I'm sat here. I've been here since the first one. And this is Spotlight with Garth Ennis.
Hello.
And this is Garth Ennis. You were going to have Leonard Sultana doing this, who's also known as an Englishman in San Diego because he does San Diego. But unfortunately he's not here, so you've got me. A little bit less personable, but yeah, never mind. So, I'd like to start, obviously, at the start. What was the thing that got you wanting to be into comics in the first place?
I think it was, voice working, that's not too bad. So I think it was growing up when I did, when you had classic 2000 AD, but also you had that period in the mid to late 80s in comics where there was a kind of an explosion of talent and potential and possibility. Most obviously you had Alan Moore, but he was followed by Neil Gaiman and Grant Morrison and Jamie Delano and Pete Milligan. But on the other side of the pond, you had Frank Miller and Howard Chaykin, you had Paul Chadwick, you had the Hernandez brothers, you had Peter Bagge, and all of a sudden, everything seemed to be coming together in this sort of explosion of possibility, and the medium looked like the most exciting thing in the world because it was quite literally growing up. It was demonstrating its potential and its possibilities, and working in comics looked like something that it looked like a going concern. It looked like something that you could do, and around about that time, people may remember that 2000 AD published a sort of spin-off comic called Crisis, which was a political comic. They were looking for new talent, and they found me and John McRae, God help them, and that was really what got me into the business. It was writing that wave of possibility, I suppose. And finding a place to work in Crisis.
Yeah, it was a very experimental time, wasn't it?
It really
was. So many new things coming up all over the place. So you got to work with Brett Ewins and...
No, I never...
In the office?
I think much later Brett did illustrate one of the Judge Dredd stories that he did, but Brett and Steve Dillon did a different comic called Deadline.
Yeah.
That was independently published. Crisis was Crisis was very much a very serious, strident political comic. Deadline nicely anticipated the coming era, the 90s, by being a great-looking comic with fantastic artwork, with stories about not very much, to be honest with you, with the single exception of Nick Abaz's fantastic Hugo Tate. Deadline was, if anything, a sort of comics version of Loaded or FHM or those things. Crisis was already outdated because it was a political comic. It was something that perhaps fit the ethos of the 80s better than the 90s, and Deadline outlasted it comfortably by a couple of years.
Yeah. So, what were your first strips in 2000 AD? Where did you? What did you actually first?
Well, after working for Crisis for about a year and a half, 2000 AD, who had the office next to Crisis, obviously, picked me up to write some of my own strips, and Strontium Dog and Judge Dredd. John Wagner, creator of Judge Dredd, of course, like many other British writers and artists, was off to the States in search of better deal, better treatment, as we just couldn't afford to write Judge Dredd full time. And he and the editor of 2000 AD sort of cast around and looked at the upcoming crop of writers and picked me. And so I suppose I was probably working for 2000 AD about a year after I began writing, something like that.
Yeah.
This was, of course, something of a surprise.
Yeah, which is nice. Yeah, it's nice, a nice place of rise, isn't it? So, what was your first? What was your first angle of getting yours writing into Dredd?
Do you know, I'm not even sure I would I would glorify the notion of my writing dread with any kind of planning whatsoever, because I did a poor job. I was not ready for the task. It was that time saw a sort of malaise in British comics, because, as I say, people had been going to the States. The guys who created the famous strips of what we might call the classic 2000 AD era were mostly off to the US, where they were treated better, where they weren't exploited as badly as they had been.
Yeah.
And so you got a lot of people like myself, like Mark Miller, like a lot of the artists at that time, who simply weren't ready for the job, but 2000 AD had to go with what it had. And that's why, that period is rightly, I think, seen as quite a grim one in 2000 AD's history. It is interesting to consider this. I did an interview with Mark Miller recently, and we were talking about how everyone, every writer, every artist, has to kind of get all the garbage out of their system before they can do the good stuff. And I'm sure that if you hunted around, you could find the crap that Pat Mills and John Wagner and people like that wrote for things like Whizzer and Chips and so on, back in the early 70s.
Without their names on, of course.
Right, fortunately
so
uncredited.
you wouldn't know, but
It was just that 20 years later, myself and Mark and people like that, we were doing it far more publicly. But you have to, everyone has to get the garbage out of their system before they can do the decent stuff.
Yeah.
And eventually, hopefully, something goes click.
Yeah.
But it did not happen for me on Dread.
Touching on the fact that credits were non-existent even in the first issues of 2000 AD. It's instant. It's an instant way of keeping your talent to yourself. Yeah. If people aren't seeing whose names are on the comics, they're not going to be going, oh, I only need another comic by. I want to read another comic by.
All you know really is the art style.
Yeah.
If you're reading early 2000 AD and battle action and so on, you're going, oh, okay, right, well, that's the Charlie's War bloke. I don't know his name, but I can't mistake him for anyone else. Writers is harder.
Yeah.
Very hard. You don't have a strong sense, especially if you're 7 or 8 and you're reading the comic, you don't have a very strong sense of who writes what. You just know when it's good and when it's not.
And when it's an in-house character.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we
even
know
harder.
That I think half a dozen writers wrote the first 6 months of Dread until it settled down under John Wagner.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's also the art debacle of Carlos is not being in the first, the first one to be put out as well, which would be another way that people got bad service in those days. And it was. It was Mr. O'Neill that put the stuff the credits in.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think with the exception of Massimo Ballardinelli, who for some reason in his contract got a credit. So if you look at the early Dan Dares, you will see his name inked in at the bottom of some of the panels.
Yeah, because Kevin was also asked to take some of the signatures.
That's right. Yeah, there's the little bugger.
Yeah, which he didn't like doing, hence he then stuck the credit cards on as next to the voting column, nice and neat and clever.
It is interesting actually when you consider that's an early example of getting away with something without making a big deal about it. And I've found again and again and again in my career that if you don't actually poke the bear, if you do what you're going to do without making a big song and dance about it, you will get away with all kinds of things. It's when you go on some kind of crusade and say, I will now, in that instance, put credits on comics, that you run into trouble. Whereas what Kev did was he put the credits in a little, art droid, script droid box. And when someone said, what's this? He said, it's just something we're trying. We'll get rid of it if the readers don't like it.
Yeah.
And, whichever executive it was who questioned him on it, then went off and forgot all about it because Kev didn't make a big deal. That's smart.
It was very smart, So, in 2000 AD, you already said that's where you got some of your weakest writing.
Yeah.
Which, are there any strips you particularly didn't like?
That I wrote?
That you wrote?
All of it? There's one good page. Anyone who suffered through the Judgment Day epic knows that it has quite a good last page with Judge Dredd and Johnny Alpha. I see that image reproduced all the time, and the line that goes with it about. And I sometimes think that if only you could bolt that onto another epic, because some Dredd epics prior to that did sort of peter out a bit. You know, it's Anderson making a wisecrack or something. You know, after 25 issues of Carnage, and I have sometimes thought, you know, if you just put that on the end of one of those really good stories, it would actually fulfill the promise of that last page. However, it was not to be.
It is a very good last page, though.
It's a good last page. It's a shame about the
amount of times it's been copied by other things, either in commissions or in homages in other stories.
So 1 out of 500, that ain't bad.
And how did you move to America?
The first thing I did was a political drama called Troubled Souls, and it had fully painted artwork because that was de rigueur at the time, and it was collected. It was one of the few crisis strips that actually did make it into collection, and that gave me this 100-page full-color graphic novel that I could hand out to publishers. And I gave a copy to Archie Goodwin, who was an editor at DC at the time, and to Karen Berger, who very obviously was famously editing the books that would form the basis of Vertigo at DC. And they both liked it, and they both picked me up to do stuff for DC. Karen asked me to pitch for Hellblazer when Jamie Delano was quitting the book, and I was one of the writers that tried out for it, and I got it. So that was really what got me into the US market.
DC, I can't remember the exact wording, but DC described your writing style as, I think they said dark, yet humorous and hopeful.
Dark yet humorous and hopeful.
I think that's the way DC
that perfectly describes my hangover this morning.
But that, to me, that description kind of touches into your early work straight away, and your interest in 2008, which is dark and humorous, but not very hopeful.
Probably not.
There's not a lot of hope in 2008, is there?
It depends what strip you're talking about. I mean, I always think of the classic era of the comic printed on bog roll, effectively. And you get, it really does run the gamut. Dredd can be the darkest, nastiest strip one week and incredibly funny the next.
That is the whole beauty of those stories. The way you can bring any genre in.
Yes.
And play with it. What I meant by no hope is that it's hard, it's dark. One of the worrying things is when you talk to somebody who thinks Tread's a good idea.
Right.
That gets a bit dark.
Yes, that is odd. I mean, yes, it's not a political comic where you've got the fascist cop, the anarchist alien freedom fighter, the feminist barbarian, but keep on keeping on, pal.
So you got Hellblazer, which obviously is a very nice start for being over there.
Yeah.
Who did you first work with on as a team?
The first artist was Will Simpson. Will, of course, would go on to greater things, greater fame with, I think he was a production designer on Game of Thrones. He was perhaps not the best choice for Hellblazer because he's very much a sort of epic fantasy artist, and there he is drawing urban horror in the early 90s. Then again, my scripts weren't very good for the first couple of years because this is the same time that I'm writing Dredd and finding my way and stumbling around. Halfway through the run, Steve Dillon came on as regular artist, and completely coincidentally, because I didn't know who was going to be drawing it, I happened to write a good script, and something just went click. It went click for my writing, but it also went click for me and Steve as a creative partnership. And from then, really, there was no looking back after that. Yeah, that really was about halfway through the run. And once Steve came on as regular artist, and he was a much more appropriate fit for Hellblazer, we really were off to the races, I think.
Yeah. And then there's why my blind just went blind.
No, it happens.
Very next thing I was going to say. Just a second.
Well, anyway, after Hellblazer,
Yeah. You go.
that of course,
Literally gone.
alongside Hellblazer, I was writing The Demon. With art by John
Absolutely love
McCrae.
Demon. I was going to talk about Demon in a bit.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
the Demon was such a strange
Such a
book.
great thing.
Yeah, it's about a demon. It's the Jack Kirby character attribute,
Yeah.
as sort of interestingly and amusingly developed, I think, by Alan Moore. And you had this, but the book had been, that the 80s incarnation of the book had been kicked off by Alan Grant. And so you had this funny, sometimes goofy story about a demon from hell in, I think, Gotham City. And I think Alan had taken it about as far, Alan Grant had taken it about as far as he could go. And the editor, Dan Raspler, was casting around for people to take over. And he picked myself and John McCrae. And we're, I think, a decent comedy partnership. So while I'm doing the darker, heavier stuff on Hellblazer with Steve, I'm developing this other string to my bow, I suppose. And John and I are doing The Demon, and we thought we could just go absolutely buck daft on that book because it looked like it was going to get cancelled at any minute. So what harm can you do? In the end, we got about 2 years out of it.
Yeah.
And of course, in the same way that Preacher came out of Hellblazer for me and Steve, Hitman came out of The Demon for me and John.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the DC event that it was in. That's it.
Yeah.
But it was in the annuals, wasn't it?
Yes.
I think it was Demon 2.
It was a clever idea of DC because what happened in those annuals, in the Bloodlines crossover, was giant aliens from space. I'm saying this, and came down and they bit people and drank their spinal fluid.
Yeah.
In one case in 1,000, the victim would accidentally develop superpowers.
Yeah.
This, of course, gives DC 30 new. They published 30 annuals. That's 30 new characters. The only problem was that this was in an era where writers, most comic book writers, had been writing other people's characters most of their careers, and they were still writing the characters that had been created in the 30s and 40s and 60s. So people like Stan Lee and so on who've done all the heavy lifting, and these guys were just coasting, writing characters. So these guys, the writers at the time, didn't know an awful lot about creating characters, and so the Bloodlines generation of superheroes were shite beyond all possible belief. And the only reason that what John and I came up with, Hitman, worked was the character himself wasn't that brilliant, but we gave him a setting and a background that was about as unlike a regular superhero comic as you could imagine. The guy was a hitman. He killed people for money. He hung out in a bar. He had no, I mean, you can see the 2000 AD influence here in a way. He had no thoughts of higher achievement. He was not out to make the world a better place. In fact, he was probably going to make the world a considerably worse place. He was in it for the money, and most of the time he would really rather be propping up the bar. And I think that helped turn Hitman into a book that gave the readership something that they couldn't find anywhere else. It was funny. I hope it was dark. It was hopeful, except when it wasn't. It had a strong streak of insanity to it, and it lasted 5 or 6 years just because just because there was nothing else like it, I suppose.
Yeah, like you say, a lot of them just came and disappeared.
Yeah, because they're an old idea that's already been recycled 5 or 6 times that is now being recycled again.
So you pretty much had full. They just said to you, make a new character.
Yeah, yep. It was just whatever you want. At the time, John and I were really into the John Woo Hong Kong gangster movies that mostly starred Chow Yun-fat. Also, not just John Woo, also Ringo Lam. But you know them: The Killer, Hard Boiled, A Better Tomorrow, Bullet in the Head, Full Contact. All these movies that had that actually heavily European influenced two-gun gangster Hong Kong stories, and we just thought, well, let's put that in Gotham City, and that was where Hitman came from.
Yeah. So when I went blank, what I should have done. We were talking about you and Steve working together then. I should have really got a good lip to Preacher, but that wasn't where I was going, so I didn't. But let's go to Preacher.
Alright, so Hellblazer, the second half of my run on Hellblazer with art by Steve Dillon, really kind of works. The sales start to go up a little bit. We get a massive boost when Vertigo kicks off. And we are seen as a successful team, and so it's at the time they were saying to a lot of people, we would like to do a creator-owned book with you. And Grant Morrison did The Invisibles, obviously. Let's see what you've got. And Preacher was what was kicking around in my head at the time, and it slowly came together. And I think that book really cemented my and Steve's careers in the US market, because it wasn't just here's what you can do with an existing character, here's what you can come up with. And Preacher, again, whatever you think of it, was like nothing else.
Yeah.
And that was what really made our names.
Yeah.
Everything else flowed from that, I think.
And of course, it's been reprinted in a few different
Yes.
places. Does that have you found that bringing brand new people to your door?
Fairly steadily, yeah. You know, it's been out there now nearly 30 years.
Yeah.
And, you know, I've seen sort of successive generations discover it. It casts a long shadow. It's generally the comic that comes up when my work is considered. I have no problem with that. I'm glad I made my name on something, first of all, that I worked on with a dear friend that is no longer with us, but also something I can still stand by and say, yep, I like that, I'm happy with that. It really, again, there was nothing else like it, and that helps enormously when as a writer or an artist, you are developing your own creative, I think this works better for writers, voice. It's nice when someone can look at your stuff and go, okay, well, no one else is doing that.
Yeah.
And that helps you enormously as you develop creatively, but also as your career develops.
Yeah.
And Preacher did that for me in spades. Really.
Yeah. So that's really where trust from other editors would be coming in from, giving you more leeway, would it be?
I think so. I think what they learned looking at it was, well, I've never seen anything like this before, and I don't quite know why it works. But clearly this guy's at his best when you leave him alone.
Yeah.
And that's something that has worked out for me very well. I mean, to this day, I do work for DC and for Marvel. And I have friends at both companies. And they know very well that there is no point in putting me on any given superhero title and very, very carefully watching me and controlling what I do and saying, no, don't do this. Green Lantern would never do that. There's no point in doing that with me. I think they realize, yeah, you put me on something and just let me do my thing, and I will quietly get on with it. And that Preacher established that notion. So that's worked out extremely well for me.
Yeah. So, I mean, you've done, some of the mainstream things such as like Punisher,
Mm-hmm.
I think, or Star Wars.
I did do a couple of those. Yeah.
How did you find taking on Punisher with the the clear American tone that it's got?
Not a problem in that I grew up on the movies that inspired it.
Right.
Punisher is unlike most American mainstream characters because they are superheroes and therefore the same idea over and over again, to my mind. Punisher comes from that sort of streak of dark vigilante crime stories that pop up in the early 70s. There's Mac Bone's Executioner, there's very obviously Dirty Harry. I think I'm wearing the t-shirt right now. And so, and I've said this before, I also feel that while the Punisher isn't necessarily influenced by 2000 AD in British comics, he seems to have been influenced by the same things that influenced the classic British comics of the 70s that I like so much. So I sometimes think of him as a character who could have slotted quite neatly into action, for instance, or even 2000 AD, who was born on the wrong side of the Atlantic by mistake. And so it was comparatively easy for me to write the Punisher. Very, very simple character to write.
Yeah.
It's not so much how you write the character as the world you put him in. But in just the same way that the Preacher established myself and Steve with a certain part of the audience, so did our run on the Punisher, because now I don't know if this is still true, but at that point you had many comic book store owners who would get Previews magazine every month and they would only order Marvel and DC titles. There was a big chunk of comic store coverage that existed only on the work of the mainstream, and they had no interest in independent comics or anything like that. So, and some of them wouldn't even go anywhere near DC. They were Marvel stores only. So all of a sudden, Steve and I are doing ostensibly a mainstream Marvel book, and that audience that would never have gone near Preacher, would never have even been aware of Preacher, is suddenly seeing weaponized polar bears and fun with quadruple amputees and that bit with the flamethrower and all that, and pushing people out of cars and all that stuff that we put in that run that Steve and I did, that is meat and drink to us, but a big part of the audience just don't even consider you could do in comics.
Yeah.
So Preacher might establish us, but that Punisher run really cements things for me and Steve. Now, I don't regard it as being all that brilliant. I think he and I both thought of that Punisher run as a sort of a palate cleanser almost after Preacher, because that had been hard work and this was easy. But a few years later, something else went click, and I found myself writing a very different Punisher series, the Max series, if you're familiar with it, where I was taking things a lot more seriously, and I wanted to write about the kind of world where a figure like the Punisher could reign supreme in a way, a more violent world, a nastier place, no more Marvel universe. Let's just take the guy and put him in his own stories. Let's write crime stories, vigilante stories, and not have superheroes popping up every 5 or 6 issues. So it was a sort of an evolutionary process, my work on the Punisher. Had I not felt as if I wanted to explore that darker side of things, I might have wrapped up my work on the Punisher with the end of the run that Steve and I were doing.
Yeah. So you've also obviously Punisher's background of where his violence comes from and such, touches quite well into you move into war stories.
Right.
Not in my mind, it does.
Yeah.
So how did you first get to do a pure war story?
At that time, I think, because Preacher had done so well for DC, they were very well inclined towards my work at the time, and essentially they were saying, whatever you do next, we'll publish, you know, because we want to capture that lightning in a bottle again. And I said, well, I've always wanted to do more comics. So I'm like, yay. I mean, the genre is very dear to my heart, and it's my favorite stuff to write, but pure war stories, not mashups with some other genre like horror or fantasy or whatever. It's not a big seller. Each war comic I do does well enough for me to do more, but it's highly regarded, I think, by certain parts of the audience. But it's not the kind of thing that explodes across the industry. They're never huge sellers. They're the kind of things that, as I say, are highly regarded, but don't necessarily kick down any doors. Anyway, I started doing my own war comics. There was a series for Vertigo, probably succeeded because I had people like Cam Kennedy, Dave Gibbons, Dave Lloyd, Chris West, and Carlos Esquerra on the art. But I did find them enormously creatively rewarding, and it's something I've stuck with to this day. The Punisher, I mean, you mentioned the link to the Punisher. He, of course, is a Vietnam veteran. Yeah. So when I did start the Max book, the obvious place to
I actually assumed I didn't have to say to the audience his background as a Vietnam veteran.
Yeah.
Maybe I should have done it.
But it seemed to me that the obvious place to start was Vietnam, and so I did a series called Born, where we went back to Frank's last days in Vietnam, where he is absolutely getting a taste for it, you might say. There's a series that's just started called Get Fury, which in a way is a prequel to that story Born. It explains why Frank ended up where he did, and it also gives you a sense of what might have been. After all, you know, the guy did have a wife and kids at home. In another reality, he might have just gone home and lived out the rest of his life, getting old and fat and happy, but 'twas not to be.
Yeah. So you mentioned Carlos in there. How did Pilgrim come about?
Pilgrim. He and I had already been working together for some time. We'd done Rifle Brigade, and we'd done a bit of work on Dread, and we'd also done a war story called Condors. And there was a publisher at the time called Black Bull, who were a spin-off from Wizard magazine, and they wanted something from me. I mean, this is the influence of Preacher, of course. You know, we'll take a punt on him. We'll see it. And Pilgrim was what I came up with. And I do not regard that as a particularly successful story, because what inspired it was a map that I'd seen as a kid, and I still have a copy of this map of the seafloor. It's like the world if you get rid of the water. And I thought, what a fantastic setting for a future dystopian Mad Max-esque adventure. Wouldn't that be incredible? But once I started to write it, I realized, oh, well, wait a minute, if you take away the sea, you get a desert. In other words, you get every dystopian future adventure story you've ever seen. You get the Cursed Earth, you get Mad Max.
The obvious one that any 2000 reader is going to see with your name and Carlos is, well, it's the Cursed Earth.
Right, exactly. And you're, but you know, by that stage, I'm writing it, and I've got to go ahead with it. And you know, I pile in as much madness as possible, but at the end of the day, it's a desert.
Yeah. Interesting enough, though, that is dark, humorous, and hopeful.
Is it hopeful?
Well, he learns from the little boy's diary. No spoilers.
Yeah, but at that point, he's caused everybody's death. I mean, he's a deeply religious man, and he has enormous convictions about faith and his faith, and therefore he gets everybody killed because he's convinced. You know, this is another vein in my work, being an atheist. I don't have an awful lot of time for this sort of thing, but you know, people who believe in magic and wizards are ultimately going to get us all killed if we're not careful. take a look at the state of the world if you don't believe me.
So, something that I'm assuming the audience want to know, something that I don't have a big thing in, is adaptations.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about the adaptations of your...
I think long may they last.
Yeah.
They've made my life. I was going to
the one streams I don't get, that's why I don't actually have a...
I mean, I was talking to Mark Miller about this. We did an interview for him recently, and I said, you know, it changed my life. Maybe a better way of putting it is that it prevented me from having to change my life.
Yeah.
Because the adaptations make my life enormously easy, and I can focus on things like war stories, like battle action, that, as I say, maybe aren't going to set the world on fire in commercial terms, but are enormously creatively rewarding.
Yeah.
So, 2 thumbs up.
Yeah. Because obviously we were aware some of our favourite creators don't like any of the adaptations of their work. That's good. So, battle action. Yesterday I heard somebody, Oliver Pickles is the editor.
That's right, yeah.
I'm in the audience and I got a little buzz just from hearing that name, because Oliver used to sell me comics in my favourite local comic store. And then one time I'm with him at Thought Bubble, and I see him there, and he's left the comic shop. He must have been a student. They move around. Oh, hi Oliver. Oh, you help me out? I'm an editor. Mulcher's nearby, comes over, laughing at me. And I said, "You used to sell me comics?" He says, "Yeah, you used to sell me comics."
John McCrae used to sell me comics. He had Belfast's first comics cupboard.
Yeah.
Sort of a shop. It was halfway up a flight of stairs.
Yeah.
But that was Belfast's alleged first comic shop.
Yeah.
Everyone starts somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. And it's to see those things and to see them connections is really. So it really was quite a nice little buzz back there when you mentioned Oliver's name. So what was it like working with Oliver?
No, he's tremendous. He's exactly my kind of editor.
You can't tell me he's awful now, can you?
He's exactly the kind of guy I like to work with, actually. He's competent, smart, catches things, knows when to shove his oar in and when to sit back. He just doesn't miss stuff. And when you're doing something like battle action, which it's doing well, but it is ultimately a passion project for all concerned, you need someone like that. You need someone conscientious and careful who's going to catch all the little things. It's been tremendous working with him, actually. I think we started, he was the assistant on Hawk the Slayer. And then when I pitched Battle Action to Rebellion, it was Oliver who picked it up and ran with it.
Yeah. I mean, you're not supposed to do personal things in panels, by the way. It's not done.
Well, actually, just thinking about it, he's the reason Kevin Neal ended up doing a strip for the first Battle Action special, because I think word had gone around that Kev had retired. This wasn't true. Alan Moore had retired, and Kev suddenly somehow got caught up in that. But Oliver looked into it and said, "No, he's still working, and we can get him." And I was like, "Yeah, well, good luck, man, Kevin Neal." But the next thing I knew, he was drawing one of my scripts, which was tremendous.
He used to slip new comics into my order because he read my blog and he'd go, "Oh, this will fit well in you." And I'd be going through and he says, it's and he'd give me tips about it. And so seeing him and what he could do as an editor, to me, I can understand that. So for me asking something that I wanted to know personally, the audiences then for questions.
I wonder if you could tell us about the boys, because we didn't touch on that when we went through your retrospective.
Oh yeah,
It's quite a small comic. I didn't think it was worth mentioning.
Yeah, it's a footnote to a footnote, really. It was really the influence of Preacher lingered, and people were still willing to take a punt on me as a sort of creative force, and that was, I was getting ready to do another long form story, And I thought, well, maybe it's time for me to answer that question that everyone eventually asks: what would superheroes be like in the real world? Answer: swine, absolute monsters, because you would have unimaginable power, nothing to hold you back. But of course, this world being the way it is, you'd be owned. There would be a corporate aspect to this. And so long as you did what you were told, you could do anything you wanted. Just do what the boss says, and you can have all the fun you want. I suppose I was thinking that on the one hand they'd be like rock stars, because they'd be famous and everyone would know them. On the other hand, they'd be like politicians, because they would have a genuine effect on our world, and of course that would be channeled and that would be directed by corporate power. And that was where the boys came from. I think that the actual characters themselves, I determined, would be as unlike the superheroes as possible. If you look at the most obvious ones, Huey, who is, I tried to write Huey as the most ordinary person imaginable, like a real person, a genuine human being who completely failed to learn from his mistakes, who did that thing that's been described as the definition of insanity, where you make the same mistake over and over again and expect it to turn out differently. That's Huey. That's his secret, in a way. Contrasting with Butcher, who of course is one of the cleverest people in the entire world, and a thoroughly nasty piece of work, and a guy who sees everyone he meets in terms of potential. He just sees a big gun sight over their faces, and he looks at them and he thinks, now what can I do with you? And it would be the two of them who would make their way through this world that had been horribly mutated by the coming of superpower, and it would be Butcher's agenda leavened with Huey's inability to come up with any agenda of his own that would determine what happened.
Who would win in a fight, the boys or martial law? Bearing in mind they both hunt heroes.
Would they have a fight? I mean, whenever
Hopefully a drink.
whenever I hear that stuff, like someone asked me about Nick Fury and James Bond, and I was thinking, like, well, would they, given that they want the same things? I must say, martial law is one of my favorites, or at least the early stuff. I thought was absolutely tremendous. Pat and Kev on all cylinders. There's a line in that that sums up perfectly how I feel about superheroes and their complete lack of appeal, and it goes something like, such a carnival of emptiness, such a pageant of non-entities, so many exotic variations on nothing. And I think, when I look at Marvel and DC's output, that's what I think. If you don't come to it's a bit like religion. If you don't come to it as a kid, it doesn't work on you. That doesn't answer your question, but it's the answer I chose.
Good, thank you.
They'd certainly end up in the bar.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Or some strange club.
So when you were talking about all your runs, you did make a contrast between the hard ones like Preacher and the easier, so to speak, about the first Punisher run. Do you remember, or can you share with us, any particular anecdote that you went into something hard and said, okay, how do we get out of this, or how does this go on? Does anything, any memory about that?
Do you mean like any of the ones you've mentioned?
Yeah, I mean the specific, what was it that made them hard?
Well, actually, The Punisher's a good example there. So I write about 30 issues of just fun and games. I mean, if you read that stuff, I mentioned the Polar Bear and Manucci and so on. You can almost hear the Looney Tunes music in the background sometimes, and then it turns into the Max book. And what changed it for me, what got my interest in the Punisher back, was actually 9/11. It didn't make me want to stop writing humorously about violence, but it made me want to explore a world not specific to the events of 9/11, but one in which things like that could happen. And it seemed to me the Punisher was the perfect comic to do that with, because he is born out of violence. He's born out of a terrible time in American history, where everything goes wrong for the entire country, and it sort of starts eating its own guts over the Vietnam War. And now here we are 30 years later, and America's about to go back to war again, a seemingly endless one. And it seemed to me that Frank was the perfect character with which to do that. So I go from silly things happening at the zoo to things like Barracuda and the Slavers and Mother Russia and Up is Down and Black is White, and I've ended up, I think, finding that much more creatively rewarding. So the Punisher, yeah, it's a good example.
Thank you.
I've been thoroughly enjoying your James Bond run. How hard was it to write a character that is so established, because everybody knows James Bond?
Not hard, because he's a bit like the Punisher, because he's so incredibly simple. James Bond shows up and he does this. He's a government assassin. He's fairly single-minded. His stories are therefore only going to go in one direction. I mean, there have been attempts to push him in other directions that haven't, I think, really worked. But what particularly helped me there was reading a couple of the old novels, where there is no attempt to make him into a palatable, likable character, where he's just a nasty piece of work. I found that very, very helpful. But really, Bond is a simple character. He's only ever going to do one thing. He's going to complete his mission in a very single-minded way. So not too hard at all. The kind of character I'm naturally drawn to, I think.
That's one question. Oh,
Well, we'll take two and then we'll wrap up.
Well, I was just going to say, can you talk about how the breakup with DC happened over the boys?
I can't give you the details because I think I actually did sign one of those non-disclosure things. You must understand that DC had me completely at their mercy there. Even though, I mean, this is known, it had been their mistake, because Wildstorm, which was the imprint of DC at the time that published The Boys, had not run the outline by regular DC. So when this thing comes out, it's a big surprise to the people in New York. Now, to this day, I do not know what the straw was that broke the camel's back. I don't know if it was a scene, a line, an issue, a moment. I don't know. But what I do know is that for about 10 days, they could have done anything they wanted. They could have just cancelled us. They could have kept us going, but neutered. That was talking about. And then Jim Lee, God bless him, stepped in. And he said, no, we should give it back to them. We should just give it back to Garth and Derek. Why on earth do we want to alienate them? There's, they're both viable creators. They make money for us. Why piss them off when we can do the right thing and just say, our mistake, take it back? My guess is that the real problem with the book was that it took the piss out of the product. The product being superheroes, and that they go on the t-shirts, and they go on the movies, and they go on the lunchboxes, and they go on the merchandising, And you can do a book like, I've said this before, but you can do a book like Preacher and rip the piss out of religion, but you better not make fun of the other holy trinity of Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman, because that will drop you right in the shit. And so that's a bad look, because DC are publishing their own, they're sort of eating their own intestines over this. But thanks to Jim, it's like, no, this was our mistake, let's give it back. And they did, and ultimately they behaved very well. I can tell you that a few years earlier, and I'm perfectly at liberty to talk about this, myself and Amanda Connor and Jimmy Palmiotti had done the Pro, which is the so it's sort of a prototypical run of the boys in a way, but it's about the hooker who gets superpowers. And the superheroes that the Pro joins up with are pretty obviously the Justice League, in the same way that the Seven and the boys are pretty obviously the Justice League. And there was a meeting with Paul Levitz, publisher of DC at the time, and Karen Berger, who ran Vertigo, and Dan DiDeo, who had just started at DC, and Jim Lee. And there was this meeting, and Paul said, well, we've all read the Pro. Yes, we've all read the Pro. And we agree then that Garth and Amanda and Jimmy are never going to work for DC Comics again. Aren't we? And the other three were like, no. So, but it's just commercial sense. That's all it is. It's like, why alienate people and piss them off when you don't have to? We can all walk away from this smiling if we just do the right thing. And in that instance, thanks to Jim, they did.
Yeah, we do. Time you go. Next one.